I'm filming this video just after Christmas, so if you're watching this for the first time, I hope you all had a good Christmas. This video is just a very quick look at a new piece of equipment I've got here, and this is an OWON XDM3051. It's a 5.5 digit bench multimeter, and if you've been watching my videos, it's probably becoming apparent that I'm becoming a bit of a fan of the new OWON products. 10 years ago I used to really hate their products. They used to be very cheap, and although they were reliable, at least the ones I had were reliable, they really weren't very nice to use. They were very cheaply made, very flimsy, poor displays, bad keyboards, that sort of thing. But the recent ones I bought over the last few years, they've really started to step up to the mark, and this is no exception. There is a range of multimeters they've released relatively recently, and the XDM3051 is one of those. And it is a mid-range bench multimeter. Now, what I've got underneath it is my Agilent 34461A, and you can no doubt see the similarity between these. You can kind of see what they're aiming for, and I think they've done a remarkably good job in the general design of it. It looks very nice, actually feels very nice. It's heavy, it's got a good steel case, good quality plastic. It's not as good in terms of quality and feel as the Agilent, but it's getting close. I think they've missed the trick with the display. I don't think the colours they've selected really do it justice, and you can see that the Agilent does have a larger display. So this video is just to have a quick look at the OWON multimeter, and we're going to compare it directly with the Agilent. Now, it's not really a fair comparison. The Agilent is a 6.5 digit multimeter, whereas the OWON is a 5.5 digit multimeter. But it's fairly rare that you need 6.5 digits on a bench multimeter. I think only maybe 5% of my projects need the 6.5 digit accuracy. So if you don't need that, you can go with something like the XDM3051. 5.5 digits is adequate for the vast majority of projects, and it's far more than you actually need for a lot of projects. Also, for the cost of an Agilent 34461A, you could buy 3 XDM3051s. Now, I would say that the 34461A is not quite the equivalent of the XDM, and it's more equivalent to an Agilent 34465A because of the features it has, and the 65 is more expensive than the 61, so this makes it even better value for money. If we take a quick look at the specification, this is not a full review, this is just a very quick look and a quick how I felt about this when I started testing it. So the accuracy is stated as being quite good. It's a 0.015% on the voltage range, and true RMS reading, of course, and then the frequency range that we're most likely to use, it's 0.2% for the AC RMS range. DC current, it does vary with the range from 0.055 up to 0.17, this is the claimed, or up to 0.25 on the 10 amp range. You've then got true RMS current, and again that's 0.5% in the range you're most likely to use it. You've got resistance, nice accuracy on the resistance. Again, it varies from 0.02 to 1.75 depending on the range you're looking at, but it does go up to 100 megs, so that's very good range that it has. It's not particularly precise at that, of course, but up to 10 meg you're getting up to 0.25%, which is very good. Diode test is at 2 volts. Continuity, it's actually variable. It says 2000 ohms here, but you can adjust it. It will measure frequency, anything up to around 200 kilohertz, depending on the amplitude of the signal you feed in. It will measure capacitance, which is why I said it's equivalent to the 34465. Temperature, and it has other functions such as it's got a trend chart, as does the Agilent, and it can read in dB, dBm, so obviously relative to 1 milliwatt, and in fact dB and dBm are really the same type of reading, one's just a few orders of magnitude greater. But it is a useful type of measurement depending on what you may need to do. It's got obviously inbuilt data logging for the trend chart. It does come with a few accessories. You get a USB lead. It comes with a manual and software, so it does have data logging software. It comes with some crocodile clips and a couple of reasonable quality leads, so it's quite nice wire, it's nice and flexible, it's not stiff PVC. You've got these removable guards on the probes, and they've been fairly smart in the design of these. These are not particularly sharp, they're not too bad, they're quite reasonable, quite nice feeling probes. They're a nice size, they're not the kind of cut down versions you often get on these cheap meters. But as I say, they've been fairly smart because they've used exactly the same diameter probe tip that companies like Agilent use. So if you take the accessories that came with the Agilent, they will fit onto here quite nicely, and so it means that if you do have accessories already, you can use those and they will fit on, and you don't need to go to the expense of buying separate ones. So that's quite a good thinking on their part. It does make the whole thing far more flexible. Incidentally, sorry for the fan noise. I'm going to be testing this using my Advantest TR6143. This is a voltage current source monitor, but it gives me a lot of control over the output, so it's good for testing multimeters. But it does have a very noisy fan. The OWON meter also has a fan. We'll listen to it later on. I'll turn the Advantest off later. These have all been running for an hour, so I don't want to turn it off because we'll be looking at some fairly accurate results, and I don't want to have these cold. I wanted them all warmed up. But we'll turn this off later and have a listen to the fan in the OWON. I will most likely modify this to reduce the fan noise. It's not horrendously loud, but it is a bit louder than I really want in a multimeter. The other thing I'm not a fan of are these rubber bumpers on the corner of test meters. It makes them take up more space on the bench than really they need to. It does look like these will come off. They are fairly flexible, and they're not molded directly into the plastic case. I've got a feeling if I take them off they won't go back on. But I may well do that anyway. I'm going to take the covers off, and in fact I'll post a follow-up video to this and we'll have a look inside. I'll do that in a separate video. Okay, so onto the meter itself. How does it perform? And I haven't really read the manual for this. I always prefer to start using things without reading the manual, just to see how intuitive they are. So far this has been quite good. The display is not as good as the Agilent, but it is very clear. I just think they could maybe change the colours they're using, but hopefully there'll be a firmware upgrade for this at some point that will give a few options for the display. I've used this for a few hours, and there are a few things I like, a few things I don't like compared to the Agilent, but part of this will be, of course, because I've been using the Agilent and got used to it, so it's not necessarily that the OWON is better or worse in some respects, it's just slightly different. So first thing, front panel layout is almost identical on the two. The only real difference is the position of the USB port. The Agilent has a soft power switch, whereas the OWON has a mechanical power switch, so it does turn off completely when you turn it off. And the only downside with that is it takes longer to settle down when you first turn it back on. The Agilent is of course slightly warmed up all the time. So in terms of the functions, they're all very easy to access, very intuitive. You just have a row of buttons under the display, select which one you want. So if you press, you'll cycle between DC and AC voltage. Same with current, you can go between DC, AC current, ohms, continuity and diode test, capacitance, frequency and temperature. It's all very easy, and each one has its own menu system. So we'll start off with voltage. As I said, this is not a full review, this is just a very quick look to see how the accuracy compares with the Agilent. And before we start, as I said, the Agilent is a 6.5 digit meter, so what I'm going to do is change this so that the Agilent is reading 5.5 digits to make them more equivalent. And then of course we're going to look at DC volts, but we're looking now at a much more equivalent display. So I'll start by setting the advent test to 1 volt. I've got the limit set to 1 milliamp, but that's irrelevant at the moment, and we don't need to turn the monitor on. We're just using this as a voltage source. This is not calibrated, but the Agilent is, and so I know the Agilent will read correctly to a few microvolts. So we'll turn the source on, we're set to 1 volt, and you'll notice straight away that the two readings are almost identical. They are within microvolts of each other, which is very impressive. So this is at 1 volt. I would have preferred if OWON had have split the display as Agilent have. It makes it easier to read. It's not critical, but it's just a preference of mine. And then in terms of the options you have in the voltage range, you can turn relative on and off, so if you want to read relative to the input. It's mostly useful if you're trying to null an offset. So if we set this to 0, notice we've got a small offset, it is the same on both, but if we want to, we can null that out on both to minimize any possible error. So I'll leave that on at the moment. We'll turn the source back on, and again notice that they're almost identical in the reading they're giving. They're not in sync, of course, so they are taking it in turns to read in effect, so just bear that in mind, but the readings that we're getting are very similar. You can turn filtering on, so we could filter to stabilize the readings we're getting. Now this is the first issue I've had with the OWON, in that when we turn filtering on, so I'll turn the filter on, and what you'll notice is there's a step offset. Now it's not while the filter catches up, it's a rolling filter of course, but it gives you a permanent small step offset. So it's like there's a bug in the firmware somewhere. It's giving a small offset that doesn't settle out, and when you turn it back off, you'll notice there's an immediate step offset. It's only maybe 10 or 15 microvolts, but it is consistent, it does it every time. Whereas when I turn the filter on the Agilent on or off, once it's settled down, it still gives the same nominal reading that it gave before you turn the filter on. It's not necessarily a big issue. You could of course null that out, but it is something that you need to be aware of if you decide to turn the filter on while you're taking readings. The input impedance can either be 10 meg, 10 gig, which again can be quite useful if you want a very high input impedance to take the readings. It can be useful for certain types of application. We can change the speed at which we are acquiring data, which will of course affect the accuracy, so we get an extra decimal place at low speed. We can set it to auto range, or we can select the range that we want to use ourselves. So if we come in here, we can select whichever range we want up to 1000 volts. I'll leave it set to auto. So that's voltage. You'll see it's got some quite nice features, kind of similar to a simplified version of the Agilent, all the basic functions that you need, but you also of course have the graph function. So we can either show this as a bar graph. It's got this weird kind of offset layout where the 0 point is not in the middle, but then it's the same for the Agilent. It's got a kind of a weird offset, and I think they've kind of copied this to make it more acceptable to maybe people that already have the Agilent. I don't like this display. I don't really use this because of that. Also, this is the only real reason I see for bar graph, or two functions, two reasons you might want to use it. One is for an immediate indication if you're using it to monitor something long term, in which case I wouldn't use this for that type of application. Or if you're looking to adjust something and you want to effectively have an analog version of the reading. Unfortunately, this is so slow as to be fairly pointless. If I vary the output of the Advent test, you'll see that the response on the OWON is so slow that it's not really useful as an analog display. It's just way too slow, and it means it's, for me at least, fairly pointless. Some people might like it, it might be useful. If we look at the Agilent, you'll notice it is much more responsive, it's much faster, but even that really is a bit too slow to use as an analog display. It's not something I would really ever make use of. In fact, I don't think I've ever used it in the years I've had the Agilent. But then you have what is useful, and that is the trend display, trend chart. These are very similar. The only real difference is the fill when you first turn these on comes in a different direction. You've got auto scale on both. Notice they're filling from opposite directions. It doesn't really matter. Once it's full, they start scrolling from the right to the left, but it's just, if you're used to the Agilent, it's just something you need to take into account if you start using the OWON. This is the second issue I have with the OWON, something I don't like. This is the sort of function I use quite a lot, and usually they're fairly long-term tests. It might be several days or even longer. I'm leaving this running, capturing data, and I don't like having it connected to the PC to do that. I don't want a PC running all the time while I'm capturing data, otherwise it kind of defeats the point of having a trend chart. But with the Agilent, if we come in and we decide we want to look at the voltage or another function, now although it's on the screen on both of them, so we've got the actual digital value on both, if we look at something different, if we decide we want to look at the number large scale on the Agilent, we can then go back and look at the trend chart, and it just continues from where it left off. We can look at recent or all data. But if we do the same thing with the OWON, so we'll go into histogram, number, and then back to the trend chart, it deletes the data, which I do not like. I think that's a fairly poor design. I'm hoping they change that. It really needs to retain the data when you re-enter that function. Otherwise it's kind of pointless to a certain extent, and there's a high risk you could lose a lot of data that you've spent several days trying to capture so you can analyze something. On both of these you can set the vertical scale. You can either set a high and low value or a center and span, and that's the same for the Agilent. So again, very similar in terms of the way they've organized this. It's got exactly the same features and the same functions. Again, I think they need to change the display a little bit. They haven't really made the most of it. The number's way too big, it's taking up too much of the real estate for a trend chart display, and the trigger is again taking up way more space than it needs to. They need to make the trend chart take up more of the screen space just to make more use of it. Other than that, I like this. It's very functional. It is quite nice. All the buttons are very responsive. There's no lag or delay when you use them. And the other functions, as I said, is histogram. That's quite useful if you're looking for row values or trying to see what your spread of values is. You can set the binning to whatever you want. It's either auto, where it will just effectively scale itself to whatever readings it's capturing, or you can set it to whatever reading you like, a bit like setting the scale on the graphical display. So quite nice. It feels quite nice to use, and if we just look at the accuracy now, we're on 1 volt. They're very similar. We'll go down to a much lower voltage. So the Advent test. It's a nice piece of kit. It will let me output any voltage from 0 up to 110 volts in 10 microvolt steps, or a current from 1 nanoamp up to a couple of amps in 1 nanoamp steps. So very nice and precise and quite useful for this. Not calibrated, but if you have a decent calibrated bench multimeter, it is extremely useful for carrying out very precise testing. So what we'll do is we'll set this to just a few microvolts. We're on 10 microvolts. I'm going to null this and take the offset off on both of these. So at the moment, if you recall, we have this set with relative on both of them, so I want to turn that off. Okay, so we're now taking raw readings with no offset. They have had a while to settle down, and you can see they've settled to very precise values. Okay, so we'll turn the source back on. So that's 0.1 millivolts, 100 microvolts, and you can see they're quite similar in terms of their readings. Again, if we null this out on both, so we're starting off with pretty much 0, we'll turn the source back on. So now notice that we are extremely close to 0.1 millivolts. And they're again reading within a few microvolts of each other. We'll go up to 0.5 millivolts. I'm going to turn the filter off on this and reset the offset. And so, as you can see, very similar readings. We'll go up to 1 millivolt. Again, almost identical, and we'll just now start going up in decades. So that's 1 millivolt, that's 10 millivolts. Again, we're comparing the two readings, very similar. 100 millivolts, $1 volt, and now we'll start going up in volts. So we'll get up to 10 volts. Okay, so still quite similar in terms of their readings. We'll go up to 50 volts. And finally we'll go up to 100 volts. Okay, so you can see the error's got slightly bigger, but still well within spec. Very impressive, considering we've just gone from 10 microvolts up to 100 volts, and we've never been more than a very small error in any of the ranges. So that's very impressive. What I'm going to do now is reconfigure this for current, and we'll do something similar and test the current between the two. Okay, I've got a setup to read current. The 2 meters are wide in series, and this is not the most accurate way to use these, of course. I'm just doing a very rough and ready comparison between the two. But I've got the current source set to 1 nanoamp, and we'll turn this on. Now, of course, we're effectively at the very lowest range of the two 5.5 digit meters. The adjunct, of course, is 6.5 digit, but I've set the mask to 5.5 digits, so they should in theory be reading the same. If we now start going up 1 nanoamp at a time, then it would of course take a very long time for us to get anywhere. So we'll go up 10 nanoamps on each step. So you can see that the Agilent very close, and the OWON lagging behind a little bit, but not too bad. If we just zero the output, you can see it's mostly down to the fact that the OWON is not reading 0 at the start. So we'll turn this back on, we'll go up to 20 nanoamps. You can see the Agilent is doing slightly better here, but even so the OWON is still within a few nanoamps of the correct reading. We'll go up to 0.1 microamps. Fairly close in reading. The Agilent is of course outperforming the OWON, but the OWON is still fairly good. We'll go up to 0.5 microamps. So still fairly good. And now we'll go up to 1 microamp. Okay, so between 0 and 1 microamp, the OWON's doing fairly well. These are very low current readings that we're taking here, but even so the OWON is still perfectly usable down at these low current ranges. We'll now start going up in decades, so we're at 1 microamp, 10 microamps, .1 milliamp, and now 1 milliamp. So you can see the OWON is a perfectly usable bench multimeter. 10 milliamps, we'll go up to 1 amp, and finally 2 amps. So the error in current is slightly bigger on the OWON, but it's still well within spec. It's not as good as the Agilent, but then this is 1/3 of the price, so that's very reasonable performance considering the value and the cost of the unit. So I'm not going to do a full review of this. If you want me to, then please leave a comment, but there are other things in here. You've got math functions, statistics that you can turn on or off. The statistics seem to be fairly accurate. I haven't done a lot of testing on these. You can't see this on the screen, I shouldn't think, but you've got min, average, max. I would prefer min, max, average, but it's just personal preference. Span, standard deviation, and how many samples it's taken. And of course you can clear the statistics and have it start again. You've got other functions in here, so you can set limits. If you want to do this, use the machine for go no-go testing in production, for example, you can do that. You can turn the beeping off if you want to. You can set the high and low limit for the test, so it can be quite useful for production. You can adjust the language, the backlight, communications. There is a real-time clock in here for capturing the data, of course. You can set up the port, so it's got USB, Ethernet and serial. Set the record data capture. You can save configurations. As I said earlier, you've got ohms up to 100 mega ohm range, including 4-wire mode. Frequency up to 200 kilohertz, and temperature. It does not come with a thermocouple, but it does take a standard thermocouple type, and you can change the units it's displaying as well as the thermocouple type that's in use. It's got a dual display, at least it does if we set valid parameters, so we can have dual display. It's a bit annoying in this mode, there's a constant clicking from a relay inside as it changes between the two measurements, and that would get a bit annoying after a while. I'm going to turn the advent test off so you can hear. I'm going to turn the adjuvant off. So I'm going to move the microphone nearer to the unit so you can probably hear the clicking. And I'll move the microphone towards the back so you can hear the fan noise. So it's not horrendously loud, but it is louder than you really want from a bench multimeter, so I will be modifying that. So I'm going to do a follow-up video. We'll have a look inside this. If you want a more in-depth review of this, then let me know. This was just a very quick look at this unit, and I've again been very impressed with this for the price. It is quite capable. There is a whole range of the meters that OWON do in this particular range, and so they go from a very cheap and cheerful version, much shallower, it's only about 2 inches deep, to this is a full depth one, and I've been very pleasantly surprised again with the OWON product. The quality, at least on the outside, seems to be extremely good. I'd say if anything the quality of this is slightly better than the power supplies I showed recently. This is really now starting to get up to sort of mid to high range quality of plastics that they're using. They've really stepped up with the quality of what they're doing. The buttons aren't backlit or anything like that, but even so they all have a nice feel. Everything's very responsive, and other than the issues I've mentioned, I so far haven't found anything to complain about with this. Fuses on the front, which is quite useful. If this is in a rack, then it saves you having to take it out if you accidentally blow the fuse. So that's it for this video. As I said, if you want a full review of this, leave a comment, and in a follow-up video we'll have a look inside this, take it apart, and see what makes it tick.